Welcome and good afternoon to those of you in Paris and other parts of Europe. Good morning or good evening for those that might be joining us from other parts of the world. I'd like to welcome you to today's Green Talks live presentation on carbon pricing trends, measuring the momentum. My name is David Bradbury. I'm the head of the Tax Policy and Statistics Division at the OECD's Centre for Tax Policy and Administration. Today I'm joined by some of our experts. In fact, I think it's fair to say that they are experts, global experts when it comes to carbon pricing. Undertaking the presentation will be Florence Flues, who is an economist within our team. And also with us is Kurt van Dender, who is the head of the Tax and Environment Unit and is the technical leader of the work that is being presented to you all today. Throughout the presentation today, you'll have the opportunity to send questions. Those of you who are joining us through WebEx, please feel free to send your questions to the chat moderator. To those of you wishing to convey your questions by Twitter, please use the hashtag GreenTalks or use our Twitter handles at OECD Tax and also at OECD_ENV. Having said that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the presentation. Throughout the presentation, to give you a highlight of what we'll be covering, we'll begin by a brief overview of the work of the Tax and Environment team here at the OECD. We'll also introduce to you the Effective Carbon Rates publication. Of course, this Green Talk today gives us an opportunity to share with you some new information, some new data that has been released today in our report, Effective Carbon Rates 2018. That was released just a few hours ago. All of that material is available on the web, but for those of you wanting to get a snapshot of what the report contains in just a few moments, you'll have that opportunity shortly. We'll also take you through the key findings of that report in some detail. Florence will do that. And then we'll sum up and give you the opportunity to ask some questions. There will be a Q&A, and as I said earlier, please use WebEx or Twitter in order to pass your questions on to us. The Tax and Environment team here at the OECD Centre for Tax Policy and Administration has three principal areas of work. There is the work on environmental fiscal reform, where we really are continuously working towards the development and refinement of our views on the principles, the key principles and their application to fiscal reform, and ensuring environmental fiscal reform is pursuing and achieving the objectives that government set for it. We also have a considerable amount of work in the area of carbon pricing, which of course is the focus of the presentation today. Not only do we have the Effective Carbon Rates publication, which is being launched today, but we also have the Taxing Energy Use publication that was launched just a little earlier in the year. They're complementary publications, and Florence will explain in a little bit more detail what some of the differences between those publications are. And of course, what we do here at the OECD is never just about theory. It's about understanding how the work we do can shape and influence government policy, particularly at the country level. And so the work that we do, both in terms of environmental fiscal reform, but also in terms of carbon pricing, we seek to apply that to the specific circumstances of individual countries to ensure that we are able to bring the best evidence available to inform and support ongoing reform at the country level. Before I talk a little about what will be in the presentation today, I want to say a few words about carbon pricing itself. I guess the question is, why do we focus on carbon pricing? Now, clearly, there are many tools available in the policy toolkit when it comes to trying to address climate change and to slow the rate of that change. But when it comes to carbon pricing, we see it as being a particularly important, it's a concrete and a cost-effective tool to try and slow climate change. And it's an important tool because what it does do is ensure that those that are responsible for emissions have to pay a price for generating those emissions. And that means that businesses and households all have a financial incentive to reduce their emissions. How they do that is a matter for them, but ensuring that there is a price, it does set that signal. And hopefully through the behavioural responses of businesses and households, we can see reductions in emissions as we steer our economies towards the low carbon growth path that is necessary in order to ensure that our planet continues to be one that's fit and habitable for us all. In terms of what we're releasing today, Florence will take you through the detail of the effective carbon rates report, where we go through and we price carbon emissions through taxes and emissions trading. We assess the position across 42 countries, both OECD and selected G20 partner economies. We also produce country notes that are available on the web, and they will provide detailed information in relation to each of the countries that are covered. To provide a little bit of historical context, we first released a snapshot of effective carbon rates at the end of 2015 at the time of the COP21 here in Paris. But the official publication was not launched until early 2016. This is the second edition of that work. The first edition involved the 42 OECD and G20 countries, but it focused on data relating to 2012. What we're releasing today not only considers the position as it was in relation to that 2012 data, but we've also tracked that through to look at two additional points in time. 2015 based on the data available, but also 2018 by making projections based on the patterns that we observe in the work that we've carried out. And of course, it is our intention to continue to update this work on a regular and ongoing basis. We see effective carbon rates as being a very significant tool for the measurement of progress by countries as they seek to meet the commitments that they've made, certainly so far as the Paris Agreement is concerned, but more broadly it provides a tool for comparison across countries. So what do we find? At a high level, we find that effective carbon rates remain far too low to drive deep decarbonisation in line with the Paris targets. We also find that effective carbon rates consist predominantly of fuel excise taxes. But what we also see is that emissions trading does play an important role when it comes to the electricity sector. One of the indicators that we produce is the carbon pricing gap. And the carbon pricing gap is determined by, on the one hand, having a look at actual carbon prices, and on the other hand, assessing what might be the price that is necessary in order to properly price the social costs of carbon. And in doing so, we establish the indicator which is the gap between the two. And we observed in 2012 that that gap was quite a staggering 83%. There has been some movement. Unfortunately, it's probably not been as dramatic as we would like, but what we have seen through to the projections on 2018 figures, that gap has been reduced to 76.5%. Some progress, but clearly there is a lot more work to be done. What we do also observe is that clearly the position varies from country to country, but we also see that rates differ strongly between and within sectors. And the one area where we see the carbon pricing gap as being at its narrowest is actually in the area of road transport. Outside of road transport, we see that the pricing gap is much larger. That's just a high-level overview of some of the key findings. But now I'd like to hand over to Florence, who is going to take us through the key findings of effective carbon rates 2018 in more detail. Before I do that, if I can just take the opportunity to remind you, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please send them through to the chat moderator on WebEx or via Twitter, the hashtag Green Talks, or to either of the two OECD handles that we mentioned earlier. Over to you, Florence.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, everyone, as well, for joining here. So I'll have a closer look at the publication, at the main results. So first of all, what are exactly effective carbon rates? Effective carbon rates consist of policies that increase the price of emission-intensive energy relative to low-carbon energy or zero-carbon energy. So we have three components here. It's the emission permit price, which you have in emission trading systems. It's carbon taxes. And the third one is specific taxes on energy use. So all these three elements increase the price of carbon-intensive energy. So, for example, coal compared to low-carbon energy. So, for example, solar and wind. In total, the effective carbon rate measures the strength of price-based incentives to reduce CO2 emissions. Why? Why do we look at carbon pricing? Why do we care about carbon pricing? Essentially, we could say carbon pricing takes the heat of climate change. Why is that the case? It's effective, so it reduces emissions. I just explained the basic principle, and I'll give two examples on Australia and the United Kingdom shortly. But it does so only very economically. What do I mean with very economically? It means you maximize the emission reductions from each euro or dollar invested in decarbonization technologies. Let's have a short example. So let us assume there's a carbon price, for example, of euro 30 per ton of CO2. Why euro 30? Euro 30 is kind of a low-end estimate of what the costs of carbon emissions to societies are today. So then there's a utility and it needs to invest in a new power plant. It could either invest in a coal power plant or it could invest in a solar power plant. The solar power plant is a little bit more expensive but has no emissions, while the coal power plant has a lot of emissions. If you make the calculation over the lifetime of the investment, you can calculate, in this example now, let us assume that the solar investment reduces emissions for 10 euro per ton of CO2. The carbon price has been, as we assume, 30 euros per ton of CO2. So you make a profit of 20 euros per ton of CO2 if you have a carbon price. So essentially what carbon prices do, they make it competitive to invest in low carbon technologies. At the same time, let us assume, for example, a household which has a car which is about 10 years old, and the household is trying to decide whether it should buy a new car, a low emissions car, an electric car, or continue driving the old petrol car which has emissions, but anyway, it doesn't require any new investment. If it does a calculation over the expected lifetime of the car, or for, let's say, the next 5 years, it turns out that the costs to reduce a ton of CO2 with the electric car for this household are 100 euros per ton of CO2. Now the carbon price is only 30 euro per ton of CO2. So what's best for the household? Not to buy the electric car yet, but kind of rather wait when it becomes cheaper. There may be, of course, other households who drive more, and the more you drive, the cheaper it becomes for you to have an electric car. But for a household which doesn't drive yet, it may not pay off yet to do so. If you think about it, what the carbon price does, it provides an incentive, or it encourages all households, all firms, all government agencies to do all the abatement opportunities, to do all the low carbon investment opportunities which are below 30 euro per ton of CO2, while not taking those which are more expensive. So in total, what happens, you carry out the low-cost abatement opportunities first, or in other words, for each euro that you invest in low-carbon technologies, you get the maximum of emission reductions. So that's what we mean with economic policy. The second point we say here as well, it supports the low-carbon transition and strengthens low competitiveness. What do we mean with the Paris Agreement? Countries have essentially agreed to decarbonize by the mid to the end of the century. If we think so, that we need to go to zero emission, it makes sense to have the right policies in place. It also makes sense to encourage the right investment. A car maybe has a lifetime of 10 years, but a utility, a solar power plant of 25, a coal power plant even longer, steel plants where you have a lot of emissions have even longer lifetimes. So it's important to take out the right investment decisions now if by mid of the century we need to do at net zero emissions. What the carbon price does, as just explained, it provides a clear signal to investors in what technologies to invest or not. So in that sense, it really makes sure that companies and firms are well prepared for the low carbon economy. As such, we think that carbon pricing is a key element of the climate policy toolkit. So now let's have an example of how effective carbon prices are. And for this, we look at the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom had an effective carbon rate in 2012 of about €7. This increased to about 32 euros in 2016. This was done by an additional policy, which is called the carbon price support, which the UK implemented in April 2012 to support the overall carbon price and to increase the carbon price. This policy was there for the electricity sector. It didn't cover the other sectors. But now let's have a look what happened to the emissions in the electricity sectors. In 2012, before the introduction of the carbon price support, with a low carbon price of about €7, there were about 160 million tons of CO2 emissions from the electricity sectors. In 2016, then when finally effective carbon rates reached more than €30, emissions went down to about 66 million tons CO2. So we have about a 60% reduction in CO2 emissions just within 4 years due to the carbon price. In overall, United Kingdom emissions declined by 25% from 2012 to 2016, and this is 19 percentage points of this are due to the cleaner electricity generation. Just to give another example, which was mentioned when the data came out, there was as well that the emissions in the UK are now below the levels of 1819. We have another example to illustrate how effective carbon prices are. And this is Australia, which we look at. Australia had a carbon tax, which also applied to the electricity sector between June 2012, when it was introduced, at 22 Australian dollars, which is about 15 euros roughly. But it was removed in July 2014. And so if we look at this graph here, the red line that are the changes in CO2 emissions from electricity generation, where the carbon price applied to, and the yellow line are the changes in CO2 emissions from petroleum, where no carbon tax applied to. So let's have a look at this here, this dotted line. Let's have a look at June 2012. That's when the carbon price started for the electricity sector in Australia. We see that electricity emissions really went down sharply up to, as said, about July 2014, when they increased again. As a comparison, in the sector where there was no carbon tax, emissions increased during the same point of time. So that's another example which illustrates how effective carbon prices are. Having illustrated the effectiveness, let me present a little bit the main results of the report. We show the main result in form of the carbon pricing gap. The report also shows additional results which go beyond the carbon pricing gap, but for the purpose of this webinar, we focus on the carbon pricing gap alone. The carbon pricing gap, it measures the extent to which carbon prices fall short of a benchmark. What benchmark do we use? Again, the 30 euros per ton of CO2, this low-end estimate of climate costs today. What you should consider is the more emissions are in the atmosphere, the warmer the atmosphere becomes, the stronger the damages from the higher climates from overheating become. The more you have thunderstorms, the more you have hurricanes, the more you have droughts and so on. So what it means that the social cost of carbon emissions also increase with the amount of carbon emissions in the atmosphere. For this, we also have a second benchmark value, which is Euro 60 per ton of CO2, which is a midpoint estimate of the carbon costs in 2020, as well as a low-end estimate of the carbon costs in 2030. But in this presentation, I focus on the Euro 30 per ton of CO2 benchmark only. We can use this carbon pricing gap to look what the state of carbon pricing gap, the state of carbon pricing in the 42 OECD countries and G20 countries is, and how it changes over time. So let me illustrate the carbon pricing gap, how it works, and what we measure exactly. So what I show here is a distribution of effective carbon rates. So on the vertical axis, you see the effective carbon rate ranging from 0 to 350 euros per ton of CO2. On the horizontal axis, you see the share of CO2 emissions from energy use in all the 42 countries together, from 0 to 100%. So if you now look at this blue graph, what you see that nearly half of emissions, essentially, if you look really closely, it's 46% of emissions are end priced in 2018. And then prices start really low, and only for about kind of like the last 10% of emissions, so from the 90s, now 10% of emissions are on the very right-hand side of the graph, you see that carbon prices have a significant rate of above 50 euros or above. So that's the distribution of carbon prices. So how do we get from the distribution of carbon prices to the carbon pricing gap? We put in here a line at Euro 30, which is the dashed line, and which shows you the Euro 30 benchmark. And now what we measure is for each percentile of emissions, how much it falls short of the Euro 30 benchmark. So if you're on the left-hand side of graph, it falls short by Euro 30 for quite a lot of emissions. But then if you go a bit more to the right hand, it maybe falls short by 10 euros or by 20 euros, something like that. So this is essentially what the carbon pricing gap does. It's a dark blue area here, what we measure, and we scale it to 100%. And what we see in 2018, the carbon pricing gap is 76.5%. How did the carbon pricing gap develop over time? We see that it has declined. 2012, it was at 83% for the 42 countries, went down to 79.5% in 2015, and 76.5% in 2018. If it would decline at the current speed being about 1 percentage point decline per year, it would not close before 2095. If you think about that, countries have agreed to decarbonize. If you look at the recent studies, what that means when you need to decarbonize, it means we would need to be at net zero emissions in 2050s, 60s, somewhere around then, meaning if the current speed of carbon pricing continues, well, decarbonization will happen without carbon pricing, or even worse, decarbonization may not fully happen as imagined. Let's have a now look at the country level. We can only use the carbon pricing gap at the country level. At the country level, we think of the carbon pricing gap, or we can see the carbon pricing gap not only as a measure of change over time, but also as an indicator of long-run competitiveness. Why? Because a zero gap indicates that a gap decarbonizes at lowest cost, and then at the same time that the companies are incentivized to compete and thrive in a low carbon economy. They're incentivized to develop and sell low carbon goods, to develop and sell low carbon technologies. Households are incentivized to make use of low carbon technologies. Then a high gap can mean two different things. It can mean either you have overly costly effort or that effort is limited. So overly costly effort, as you remember before, I said kind of like carbon prices really make sure that you take on all low-cost abatement opportunities first. So it means if you lose other policies, of course that's possible, but most likely you will pay more. You most likely will lose out on some low-cost abatement opportunities. So let us assume we have a country which decarbonizes for 10 euros per ton, country A, and another country, so this country using carbon prices, country A, while country B doesn't use any carbon prices, but also has strong decarbonization policies, but it decarbonizes for 100 euros per ton of CO2. What does that mean? Well, country A spends way less money on decarbonization. So what can it use this money for? It can cut taxes. So for example, taxes on labor income or capital income, if this is the intention of the country. Alternatively, it could use the funds to invest in education, in health, in other infrastructure it needs. It could use it to pay off debt, to get all the better credit conditions. That's the case if you focus on overly costly effort. If you don't do any decarbonization policy at all, if you just remain with business as usual, what are the risks there? There are several transition risks which countries face. So there are technology risks. Technology risks are that you have some countries which already decarbonize, they develop new technologies which are in the end more resource efficient, may be better, may also be more demanded by customers. you are risking not developing this technology. So over time, you're risking not producing goods which are in demand. So this is very closely related to market risk, that essentially over time, the demand for goods, high fossil fuels, becomes limited. You can have reputation risks, so that people don't want to buy these high carbon goods anymore, don't want to buy goods from countries anymore which only produce high carbon goods. You have litigation risks. Litigation risk, there's essentially the idea that you have now some court cases pending, essentially, where you have people who suffer from climate change are suing companies who emit a lot of carbon emissions, and actually sue these companies not for having paid for the damage what the carbon emissions are. So there's, for example, a case where a South American farmer sues a German utility to pay for the damage he has due to climate change. And there are policy risks. Policy risks means essentially that you may have some, if you don't do anything against climate change, you can have very strong extreme weather events in the future, and then at a sudden point, you need to increase your climate policies. But if you haven't invested in the low carbon infrastructure yet, if you're still running coal power plants, if you're still running very emission intensive production technologies, suddenly your assets, high carbon assets, are not really worthless anymore because you can't continue producing. So essentially what you face here, the risk, summing up, that the demand for high carbon goods, for high carbon asset disappears. If the demand for high carbon goods and asset disappears, asset prices will fall, and this can have very detrimental effects to economies, up to causing an economic crisis. Let us now have a look how the carbon pricing gap differs across countries. So we have here the carbon pricing gap on the horizontal, and the vertical axis we show the carbon pricing gap. The closer you are kind of like at the lower end, so it means you have no gap, while if you're at the top, it means you have 100% gap. We see here that the carbon pricing gap differs significantly, very significantly across countries, from 27% in Switzerland, with a fairly low carbon pricing gap in 2015, to some of the countries here, Brazil, Indonesia, Russia, which have carbon pricing gaps of 100% or close to. So you already see today a huge variation in the carbon pricing gap of the countries, or you see huge variations in how well countries are prepared for the low carbon economy. Let us have a look at sectors. So we now go back again and look at the sectors. We aggregate here the results across the 42 OECD and G20 country, because these patterns are often similar in most of the countries, but although there are some variation in there, but it illustrates the main effects. And what we see, that the carbon pricing gap is fairly high in the electricity, industry, residential, commercial sector, where it's all above 80%. In road transport, it's considerably lower at 21%. Why is that? In the road transport sector, essentially, you have a lot of excise taxes on energy. So you have taxes on petroleum, petrol and diesel, and these taxes make sure that some carbon emissions are priced. This brings me essentially to the next slide and asking kind of what of the components of the effective carbon rates dominate. So it said like the effective carbon rates consist of taxes, carbon taxes and excise taxes on energy, as well of permit prices. What we show here is the share of the tax component in total ECRs, so the carbon taxes and the taxes on energy. We see that the tax component is really the most important component for most of the sectors. It's above 90% in 4 of the 6 sectors, so in agriculture, in off-road transport, residential and the commercial sector, and in road transport. The only really strong difference is in electricity, where the tax component only contributes to 20% of the total effective carbon rates. So we see in the electricity sector that emission trading system really make a strong difference in terms of carbon pricing. We also see in the industry sector that their tax component being 62%, that there, although the emission permits with about 38% make a difference, a significant difference to the overall effective carbon rate. That's the state as it is. One of the things, this question can, what do we expect? How will carbon pricing continue in the future? Well, we've seen that progress with carbon pricing is slow. At the same time, we've seen levels often remain low, but there's also large heterogeneity, both across sectors, but also across countries. Nevertheless, and that's the positive news, we do see some signs of increasing momentum. So in China, we have a national ETS, which is under discussion, and we expect stronger rules. Sometimes there are also rumors about a carbon tax, but what we take here into account for the report is a national ETS, essentially kind of all the information which was given out end of last year, how it should be introduced. And what we see there, that if it's really introduced as planned, and it would cover electricity sector emissions in China, plus 1.5 billion tons of CO2 in the industry sector, the overall carbon pricing gap would shrink to 63% from currently 76.5%. So the Chinese emission trading system can really make a strong difference. At the same time, the the carbon pricing gap for China would go down from 83% to 43%. So that would be a really strong impact on carbon pricing. It could be really in terms of a game changer in terms of carbon pricing. We see that a lot of different approaches in other countries. So Canada has an interesting approach. It looks kind of what its territories and what its provinces do in terms of carbon pricing, but if they don't do enough, there is this carbon pricing backstop which shall be introduced. This carbon pricing backstop at the same time shall increase over time, so by the reaching levels of about 50 Canadian dollars by the mid-2020s. If that would be the case, the carbon pricing gap in Canada would go down pretty close to zero at the same time. We have other approaches which are very interesting to look at in France and Mexico. France and Mexico both reformed their energy taxes, and this also led to significant decreases in their carbon pricing gaps. Korea introduced an emission trading system in 2015, which led to a really drop in their carbon pricing gap. And the interesting thing about the Korean emission trading system is that it nearly covers all of Korean emissions, while other emission trading systems often only cover parts of emission, only certain sectors. But the Korean emission trading system is really broad-based. The United Kingdom, I already talked about the carbon price report and about its effectiveness. Switzerland has an interesting policy in that it sets reduction targets, and if these reduction targets are not met, its carbon tax automatically increases. We have the EU ETS reform recently, and we also have discussions in the EU about increasing effort for the 2030. So we had the Commissioner Canete discussing whether up to 2030s the EU climate targets should not become more ambitious. What we have here as the counterfactual, we look at what would happen if carbon prices in the EU ETS would increase to Euro 30 per ton of CO2. This would lead to a drop of the carbon pricing gap for the 22 EU ETS countries from 52 to 22%. So for the EU, this would be a significant drop in its carbon pricing gap. So just to illustrate, what I show here is kind of like how could the carbon pricing gap decline over time, going from a gap as it is currently now over time. The dark blue line, what you see here, is this 1 percentage point decrease a year. And then we see we don't really go down, we don't really use carbon pricing much to a decarbonization. I have here the light blue line, which is just to illustrate and looking at kind of the new efforts, the new ambitions, the new efforts which are made with regard to carbon pricing, that actually there's no need that we need to assume it's linear. It could become way stronger, being it here this blue line or the even lighter blue line, meaning kind of like if some countries really go stronger on carbon pricing, the carbon pricing gap trajectory can essentially lead to closing the carbon pricing gap way earlier. And I think, for example, in China, this can make a huge difference. With that, I just sum up once again what have been the highlights of this report. So what we have seen, that effective carbon rates remain too low to drive decarbonization in line with the Paris Agreement, but we also see that there are increasing signs of momentum. We've seen that effective carbon rates consist mainly of excise taxes on fuels, but we see that emission permit prices make a difference for the electricity sector. as said, the carbon pricing gap declines slowly, but we have increasing momentum. And we do see that rates differ strongly across countries and across sectors within countries. So the countries with the lowest carbon pricing gap is currently at 27%, while the country with the highest carbon pricing gap is currently at 100%. So we see that some countries are already well prepared for the low carbon economy, for prospering in a low carbon world, while other countries still need to do more. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and we look forward to any questions you may have.
Well, thanks very much, Florence. That's a very detailed presentation, but for more information, please, I would direct you all to the OECD website where the full report is available, the country notes. There's also a video, a brief video to accompany the material, and also a brochure that has been released to provide you with the highlights of the report. Before we move into the Q&A, can I take the opportunity to thank the Environment Department here at the OECD for allowing us the opportunity to use this Green Talks series, which is a very successful series, as the basis upon which we could launch today's publication. It's a very strong collaboration that we have with our colleagues in the Environment Directorate, and that will continue to be an important part of the work that we do as we move forward. There have been quite a few questions, and in fact, I think I'm going to have to group some of these together so that we can cover as much ground as possible. One of the first questions that came in, I'll try and summarise this as best as I can. The question was, and perhaps if I could bring Kurt van Dender in to answer this one. Kurt, the head of the Tax and Environment Unit. You've shown that carbon prices are too low and the base to which they apply is too narrow. There has been some improvement on both aspects, but it is slow and piecemeal. I'd be interested to hear your views on how to increase momentum on carbon pricing. Who needs to be convinced? If carbon pricing is obviously such a good policy, why hasn't everyone adopted it? And what can we learn from jurisdictions that have introduced carbon pricing? Well, I think we'll all be waiting for this with bated breath, Kurt, because if you've got the answer to this one, then we can all leave the Green Talk seminar very satisfied today. But I'll hand it over to you, Kurt.
Thank you. I'll do my best. So that's indeed a very good and very important question, because essentially we're not just here to describe the state of carbon pricing, but to try to find ways to increase its use. So Florence has made the case. It's effective, it's cost effective, so economically this is good policy. We know that climate change is real. We know, as Florence also emphasized, that waiting to take action will increase the costs of adapting or mitigating climate change, or both. So all these things are well known and are empirical facts. This is clear, so all we have to do is sit back and wait for the world to do the obvious, which is to adopt carbon prices. Well, that's not really happening. That's what we see in the results of the effective carbon rates work. I mean, are some signs that momentum is increasing, but it really needs to be faster if we want to use carbon prices in a way that matches the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. Why doesn't this happen? Well, first, there's climate as such. It's an important issue, but it's not an important issue for everyone. Some people still think that this is not something that needs urgent attention. There are, of course, competing policy objectives. There are other things that politicians need to deal with. These two things combined lead to an inclination sometimes to wait with adopting climate policy in general and carbon pricing in particular. What we emphasize in our interpretation of the results here is that waiting really can be very costly, and we need to convince policymakers that waiting is an expensive option, actually. That's climate in general. Then you can think about carbon pricing itself. So even if you would be convinced that climate is an important policy issue, you need not necessarily be convinced that carbon pricing is the right way to mitigate emissions. There is growing evidence on this actually. There is skepticism with the public about the effectiveness of carbon pricing. I mean, energy demand is thought to be relatively fixed and not very elastic. There is resistance to the idea of having another tax, just another tax. So that makes convincing people of the fact that carbon pricing is a good idea. It makes it quite difficult, and it actually can go that far that people dislike carbon prices or taxes so much that they actually start to doubt the policy issue itself, namely climate change. So there is a difficult policy issue to handle there. What do we need to do? Well, we need to consult and engage with stakeholders. We need to convince them that pricing works. We know this is the case. We have evidence for it, but we need to communicate it probably better than we do. We need to convince them, and this is something that Florence tends to push very hard, we need to convince them that waiting is costly, so there's an urgency. We need to talk about benefits. We need to talk about co-benefits. Reducing air pollution, for example, tends to be a potential important co-benefit of carbon pricing. That's important. We need to talk about policy packages. We should not speak about carbon pricing in isolation. We should talk about a policy package. And in that policy package, the revenue use issue is a very important one, which there is a growing literature on, which argues that clarity about what you're going to be doing with the revenues from carbon taxes or from emissions trading systems is essential to the public support or the public tolerance of carbon pricing systems. We're doing some work on that actually that we hope to release by the end of the year, where we show that, the way you use the revenues from carbon pricing affects political and public support. It also affects the economic case for carbon pricing itself. I mean, this is easy to see. If you're going to burn the revenues, you probably shouldn't be doing carbon pricing. So good use of the revenues is a prerequisite for carbon pricing to make sense. This is something that we show. We look in a very detailed way at what 40 countries do with the revenues from carbon pricing, the three components that Florence talked about, so excise taxes of energy use, on energy use, carbon taxes, and emission trading systems, three sources of public revenue. We study what countries do with that. We see lots of variety in what countries do with the revenues, depending on the instrument, depending on countries' specific circumstances. Lots of variety, but also strong evidence that it is possible to build a policy package that helps garner support for carbon pricing by making very clear what you're going to be doing with the revenues. What exactly you do with the revenues is very much context specific. So some countries, European countries, British Columbia, have used the revenues from carbon taxes as an element of broad tax reform. That works in a lot of places. It doesn't work everywhere. Other places, especially places where revenues, public revenues at this point are quite low, their carbon taxes can become an element of domestic resource mobilization. Very important policy objective in a large number of countries. In other situations, it seems to be politically more expedient to connect carbon pricing to green spending. This is particularly the case if you look at emissions trading systems, where the connection between the pricing element and the spending on green issues is often quite strong. So it all depends on specific circumstances. The one point that we build upon that evidence, and that's maybe for discussion, is the question, if we really want to raise carbon prices to levels that we think are needed to reach Paris Agreement targets, which is 30 euros, but then going well beyond that as soon as we can. If we would want to do that, then we're actually going to be raising quite a bit of revenue in that process. If we have that much revenue, does it still then make sense to think about the revenue from carbon prices as something which is close to the environmental climate policy sphere, or is it something which is more broadly structural economic policy in general? We tend to think it's more the second. You're going to be raising 2 to 5%, depending on the place, worth of revenue as a share of GDP. This is a lot of public revenue. To think that this is going to be purely an environmental issue may be not the most politically expedient thing to do if you want to have across government support for carbon pricing to that extent. So it needs to become an across government issue in that sense, where ministers of finance and budget ministers become involved with the debate more strongly than they presently are. So that's for reflection. This is one of the issues, by the way, that we discuss in the Paris Collaborative on Green Budgeting, which is an initiative related to the One Planet Summit, where we try to think how carbon pricing and more generally environmental policy can be integrated with countries' fiscal and budgetary policies. So I would invite anyone to follow up on that initiative to get insight into these kinds of debates.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks, Kurt. That was a very big question that you were asked, and the answer was comprehensive. I'll come back to you in a few moments to ask a question. We've received a few questions around the political economy of implementing reform. But before I do that, perhaps in the interest of trying to get through as many questions as possible, there are a couple of ones that I think have fairly short answers, so I'm hoping. So I'll run through those fairly quickly. Firstly, there is a question about whether VAT is included or excluded from all tax levels. Florence.
Thank you, David. We don't include VAT in the effective carbon rate. Why is that the case? Because VAT applies to all fuels, both renewables and fossil fuels, so it doesn't change the relative price of carbon emissions. So as such, VAT doesn't have an impact on whether you go for a clean fuel or for a dirty fuel.
Thanks, Florence. Another one that has just come in is in relation to emission trading schemes and systems generally. The question is, are they limited to certain specific sectors, or are they generally open to all?
Thank you very much. This is a very interesting question, and it really depends on the emission trading system. So when we look at the systems, what we found that emission trading systems are very, very different and quite far away from what maybe economists have learned in their introduction to environmental economics, how an emission trading system should look like. And what we see that some countries use emission trading systems which apply just to a few sectors, while other countries or subnational regions use emission trading systems which apply to their whole economy. So this coverage is already very different. We have emission trading system just applying to 40% of a country's emissions, while we have other where they apply to nearly, 90%, or really a lot of emissions from energy use, nearly all emissions from energy use. And then there's also a lot of difference in the design of emission trading system. So some emission trading system, for example, have additionally minimum prices on carbon permits, while others don't. There's a lot of different design issues, and this is one thing which we discovered, and where we actually always think about it. It may be very interesting to have more comprehensive comparison of the different design features and what they imply.
Another question, we've received a few questions about the variations in carbon pricing gaps across countries. One question that asks about what are the risks of not taking action. I think you have covered that reasonably substantially in the presentation. We have another question on that point of country positions that asks, in the 2016 report, there was no calculation of one single average national ECR, which would have made inter-country comparison easy and interesting. Was this choice repeated in this year's report? And if so, why? Kurt.
Yeah, thank you. We do not calculate average national ECRs because we think an average across the distribution of the effective rates that we observe might very well be misleading, given the large heterogeneity of the rates that we observe across countries and within countries. To say that there is one single average that could kind of represent that distribution. Florence just put up the distribution again. I mean, describing this with an average really does not really make that much sense. This is why we try to show the distribution, preferably. And if we're going to summarize it in a single indicator, then we use the carbon pricing gap, which Florence has described what it looks like, what the definition of that is, and he has shown it both at the country level and across countries. So we think we can do cross-country comparisons, but we prefer to do them with the carbon pricing gap rather than with the average.
If I may add a few more words, if you're looking at the distribution, if you have an average and you have a few emissions which are priced like, as you see here, at around 200, 300 euros per ton of CO2, they heavily influence the average effective carbon rate. So if you have 10% of emissions priced at 300 euro per ton of CO2, you have an average effective carbon rate of euro 30. If you then compare that average effective carbon rate to the social cost of carbon emissions, euro 30, you may think we are all fine, but what you're forgetting are the other 90% of carbon emissions which are entirely not priced. So this is one of the reasons why we actually have developed now this summary indicator, this carbon pricing gap, which gives you an overview of the distribution and not just kind of a single number which ignores large shares of the distribution.
Another question on the carbon pricing gap. Perhaps, Florence, if you could just clarify the figure that has been cited of 76.5% in 2018. What year is the data that figure relies upon?
So this figure refers to our estimate for 2018. If you're interested what exactly is in the estimate, you'll find that in the beginning of chapter 2 of the report. It's essentially we're using all the data and information we had in the beginning of the year of what carbon pricings have been in 2018.
Perhaps, Kurt, another difficult question, and this may well be, given the time, this may be the last question that we have time for. The question is about the widespread resistance to carbon taxes. There are usually groups that benefit from the tax changes. For example, a carbon tax on one social group, presumably high energy users or producers, might be accompanied by a revenue or tax break for another social group. Obviously, that goes to the question of the overall package of the reform. There are two parts to the question. The first one is the resistance to the proposed tax usually explained by the fact that the group most disadvantaged by the tax is the most politically powerful? And the second element of the question is, are there any other more general, or this might be taking you out of your comfort zone, but any general or psychological reasons for the resistance to carbon taxes?
Thank you for that question, which indeed is not a very easy one. So there is widespread resistance. It is clear that some economic sectors and some types of households stand to lose more from carbon pricing without any accompanying policy than others would do. So households that use a lot of energy, for example, rural households in a lot of countries tend to have more energy-intensive lifestyles by necessity almost than some that live in more urban regions. Okay, the impact is differential. Is this something that we should take for granted and leave as is? No, in the case of the households, it's essentially actually not that difficult to develop accompanying policies that would be targeted towards these households specifically and would help them adapt to higher energy prices in a selective way. So this is something that that can be done there. This is a question that has been studied in quite a bit of detail in countries that are serious about trying to introduce higher carbon prices. For example, France, We also have done a study on the impacts of higher energy prices at the household level on the affordability of energy. So this is not a question about equity, where the question is, do higher income households have a higher or lower proportional burden compared to poorer households? No, the question we asked here is whether those households that are usually at the lower end of the income distribution and face higher energy prices, if those now are going to face an affordability risk, so are they at risk of becoming energy poor, let's say. We find that obviously almost can be the case if you're going to introduce higher energy prices. But we also find that if you introduce targeted transfers for these types of households on the basis of relatively easily observable characteristics, that then you will need only a part of the carbon pricing revenue, of the carbon tax revenue, to compensate these households specifically. So as an order of magnitude, you take 1/3 of the extra revenue, and that would be more or less sufficient to address the affordability risk on those households that tend to be at the lower end of the income distribution. So this is not, this is a policy issue that can be managed. It's not easy to manage, but it can be managed. At the business level, competitiveness issues have been studied. The evidence that exists obviously applies to current carbon price levels, which are not necessarily always very high. But there we do find that competitiveness impacts are actually virtually absent. We can't really measure them. So perceived competitiveness at current carbon prices is different from real competitiveness. This is a communication issue. We should explain that competitiveness risks are not always as large as they're perceived to be, and this is then an element that can help in policy design. This is competitiveness in the short run. Florence has emphasized we should think about competitiveness in the long run. If we take seriously the Paris Agreement, then a policy that's going to try to slow down adaptation to climate change and to a low-carbon society is not actually a pro-competitive policy, it's an anti-competitive policy. So we should think more about how we're going to gradually help firms transition to a low-carbon environment. There will be firms, businesses, energy-intensive ones, that are disproportionately hit. We can think about time-limited compensation for some of those. But in general, competitiveness or equity impacts are not in themselves factors that should lead us to think that carbon pricing is politically not a feasible proposition, I would argue.
An excellent response, and I think a good note upon which we can draw this session to a conclusion. I do want to pick up briefly on the points that Kurt just made, and to note that Kurt and the team here in the Tax and Environment team have been doing a lot of work on the political economy of carbon pricing and environmental tax reform. And the two areas that Kurt identified there around competitiveness and also the distributional impacts. Firstly, there is obviously a political debate to be had out there in communities whenever reform is proposed, and there are a whole range of considerations that come into play. But what Kurt and the team have been doing very effectively is undertaking new research to try and better inform some of those discussions. And as Kurt said, certainly in terms of distributional impacts, there can be some serious distributional impacts, but it is a question of policymakers having the tools at their disposal to then try and ensure that they mitigate those impacts. On the competitiveness front, I think the evidence does show, perhaps contrary to what may be the view out there in communities, that the competitive impacts are certainly not discernible to the extent that they exist at all. But the long-run competitiveness question, I think, is the one that really is the most potent one. But no doubt there continue to be challenges in whether or not these arguments can prevail in the domestic context in countries all around the world. But as we say, the good news is that we are making some progress. The bad news is it's not nearly enough or not nearly fast enough. But hopefully We won't be waiting until, what was it, 2095 to close the gap. I can guarantee I won't be waiting until 2095, but I hope for my children and their children we can get a wriggle on and do something faster than that. Before I conclude, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the production of this Green Talk, from the Environment Directorate, also all of the support staff here, the Centre for Tax Policy and Administration, and also with all the technical know-how and support. Can I remind you all that this Green Talk will be available on the web. We do this to make sure that my mother in Sydney has the opportunity to download it tomorrow, but you're all welcome to download and have a look at the webcast, which will be on the web and available into the future. Once again, thank you very much for tuning in. Thanks to those of you who have joined us here in Paris. Can I wish you a very good evening or very good day, and please do go to the website, download the materials, and we look forward to seeing you at a future Green Talks. Thanks very much.